The air was unnaturally still as Lucas stepped into the deserted park. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of rusted metal from the carnival rides that seemed to sway without cause. The once vivid colors of the circus tent were now faded and muted, as though the life had been drained from the very fabric. He paused, his flashlight trembling in his grip, its beam piercing the suffocating darkness ahead. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, curling and twisting like unseen hands reaching for him. Something wasn't right. He felt it in his chest, a suffocating weight pressing against his ribs, urging him to turn back. But curiosity was a powerful thing, and Lucas had always been its victim. A sudden sound, metal scraping against metal, sent his heart racing. He whipped the flashlight around, illuminating the Ferris wheel. Its carriages dangled like forgotten ornaments, but one of them was moving. It swayed gently, as if someone, or something, had just climbed aboard. He froze, holding his breath as his eyes locked on the carriage. Then it stopped. Dead still. The oppressive silence returned, more menacing than before. The scent of damp earth and decaying would fill the air as Lucas approached the main tent. Its entrance hung slightly ajar, the edges of the fabric frayed like jagged teeth. A faint glow emanated from within, flickering inconsistently, as though the light source was alive and struggling for breath. As he stepped closer, he noticed faint footprints in the dirt, leading inside. They weren't human, too small, too narrow. The prints twisted and overlapped, as if the maker had danced erratically in a fit of madness. Lucas felt a chill crawl up his spine, his mind racing to find a logical explanation, but no such comfort came. Summoning every ounce of courage, he pulled the entrance flap aside. The air inside was stifling, heavy with an unplaceable stench. The tent seemed impossibly large, much bigger than it had appeared from the outside. Its ceiling stretched into a void of shadows, and the faint light came from a single flickering bulb suspended by a threadbare wire. Rows of empty seats circled a stage in the center, their red cushions torn and leaking stuffing like spilled entrails. As Lucas stepped forward, his foot struck something. He looked down to see a clown's shoe, oversized, worn, and caked with dirt. A dark stain spread across its surface, and he instinctively recoiled. Then he heard it, a laugh. Faint, distorted, and echoing, as if carried on the wind. It wasn't joyful or warm, it was hollow, mocking, and deeply unsettling. The laugh grew louder, more distorted, reverberating around the tent until it felt like it was coming from inside his own head. His flashlight flickered, the beam faltering as the darkness seemed to close in around him. "Hello," he called out, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. The laugh stopped instantly, replaced by a deep, suffocating silence. And then, a whisper. "Close. Too close. Why did you come here?" Lucas spun around, but no one was there. The flashlight beam landed on the stage, where a shadow shifted, darker than the surrounding gloom. It moved unnaturally, as if it wasn't bound by the same laws of reality. Lucas backed away, his breath quickening, his instincts screaming at him to flee. But something about the shadow held him captive, its form pulsating with a sinister energy. As the whisper grew louder, more insistent, Lucas felt a hand, cold and clammy, brush against his arm. He jerked around, the flashlight falling from his grasp and rolling across the floor, its beam now illuminating an empty seat. Or at least, it had been empty. Sitting there was a clown. Its face was painted white, with streaks of black running from hollow, sunken eyes. Its red lips curled into a grotesque grin that seemed too wide, too unnatural. It tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate, as if studying him. The grin widened. Then, without warning, the bulb overhead exploded, plunging the tent into absolute darkness. What happens next? Stay tuned for more of this chilling tale, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Haunted Grounds for stories that will keep you awake at night. Lucas stumbled out of the tent, his breath shallow and ragged. The night air hit him like a shock, but it did little to calm the chaos in his mind. He leaned against a crumbling fence, his hands trembling as he tried to piece together what he had just witnessed. That clown, its dead, unblinking eyes, was seared into his memory. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the vision as a trick of the mind. But deep down he knew the truth. Something dark and otherworldly was unfolding here, and he was already tangled in its web. As he moved deeper into the park, his flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams of light across the dilapidated attractions. It was then he saw it, an old carousel, its once bright horses now faded and peeling, their faces frozen in grotesque expressions of fear rather than joy. The carousel creaked and groaned, though there was no wind to move it. Lucas felt drawn to it, an inexplicable pull in his chest, as though the air itself was pushing him forward. Approaching cautiously, he noticed something hanging from one of the horses' necks, a weathered photograph, fluttering slightly in an unseen breeze. He plucked it with trembling fingers and flipped it over. His stomach dropped. The image was faded, but the figures were unmistakable, a group of clowns, their makeup smeared and costumes tattered. In the center stood a familiar face, a man he recognized from old family albums. It was his uncle, smiling weakly, a balloon in one hand and a weary look in his eyes. Written in shaky handwriting at the bottom were the words, "The Final Show." Lucas's heart raced as fragments of a long-buried memory surged to the surface. He had been a child, sitting on his uncle's lap as the older man told him stories about life on the road with the circus. There had been laughter, warmth, until that one summer night when his uncle vanished without a trace. The family never spoke of it again, brushing it off as a runaway act, but Lucas had always felt there was more to the story. Now, standing in the heart of this cursed carnival, he couldn't shake the feeling that his uncle's disappearance was connected to whatever horrors were unfolding here. The photograph felt heavier in his hand, as though it pulsed with an unnatural energy. Suddenly, the carousel began to move, the horses lurching forward in a slow, uneven rotation. A haunting tune played from the broken speakers, distorted and warped, like a child's lullaby played backward. Lucas staggered back, clutching the photo, his mind screaming at him to run. But then from the corner of his eye, he saw movement, something crawling beneath the carousel. A figure emerged, dragging itself forward with jerky, unnatural movements. It was wearing a tattered clown costume, its makeup smeared and streaked with something dark. Lucas froze as the figure lifted its head. Its face was barely human, its features twisted and malformed, as if time and torment had reshaped it into something monstrous. But its eyes, they were unmistakable. They were his uncle's. The creature rasped his name, its voice a guttural whisper, broken and desperate. "Lucas, you shouldn't have come here." The word sent a chill through his entire body. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but his voice was caught in his throat. The figure lurched closer, its movements erratic, like a puppet with its strings cut. It reached out a hand, gnarled and trembling, as if pleading for help. "Leave before it finds you." Before Lucas could respond, the carousel screeched to a halt, and the lights around the park flickered violently. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and a deep guttural growl echoed from somewhere within the darkness. The creature that was once his uncle recoiled, its face contorted in terror. It whispered one final word, "Run." Lucas didn't need to be told twice. He turned and sprinted, the photograph clutched tightly in his hand. Behind him, the carousel erupted into chaos. Lights bursting, horses breaking free from their poles, their twisted faces seemingly chasing him. The haunting tune morphed into an ear-splitting cacophony of laughter and screams. As Lucas fled, one thought consumed him: whatever force had claimed his uncle was still here. And now, it was coming for him. Lucas's legs burned as he ran, but no distance seemed far enough. The oppressive darkness of the park seemed alive, pressing in around him as if guiding him back to the horrors he sought to escape. His breaths came in ragged gasps, and the photograph in his hand felt like a lead weight. He clutched it tighter, the image of his uncle's haunted eyes searing into his mind. Somewhere behind him, the distorted carousel music faded, replaced by an eerie, pervasive silence. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of quiet that feels like something watching, waiting. He stumbled into an old game booth, its wooden frame rotting and covered in mold. The shelves were lined with dusty, eyeless stuffed animals that seemed to twist toward him in the dim light of his flickering flashlight. As he leaned against the counter to catch his breath, a chilling sensation crept over him, like icy fingers brushing against his spine. His light flickered again, revealing something on the ground, a small wooden box, its surface covered in ornate carvings that pulsed faintly with a sinister glow. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave it alone, Lucas knelt to inspect the box. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid, revealing its contents, a stack of old photographs and a yellowed piece of parchment. The photographs were hauntingly similar to the one he had found earlier, depicting clowns and performers, each photo more disturbing than the last. In some, the figures were distorted, their faces blurred or stretched as if captured mid-transformation. One photograph made his heart stop. It showed a young boy sitting on a clown's lap. The boy was Lucas. The clown, unmistakably, was his uncle. The parchment was covered in jagged handwriting, a series of desperate warnings and cryptic instructions. To end this, one must make a choice, it read. The box will reveal what you hold most dear, and to save yourself, you must sacrifice it. But beware, what you sacrifice may never return the same. The words clawed at Lucas's mind, their implications sinking in like icy needles. He had no idea what the box would demand, but the thought of giving up something precious made his stomach churn with dread. Suddenly, a low growl reverberated through the booth, shaking its fragile structure. Lucas turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but nothing was there. Then from the darkness, came a voice, raspy, disjointed, and chillingly familiar. "Lucas, it's time to choose." It was his uncle's voice, but twisted, layered with something inhuman. The photographs in the box began to shift, the images blurring and reforming into something new. They now showed scenes from Lucas's own life, his family, his friends, moments he cherished most. Each photo flickered with a faint, ghostly light, and as they did, the growl grew louder. The booth shook violently, and from the shadows emerged a figure. It was his uncle, or what remained of him, dragging himself forward with grotesque, jerky movements. His face was a contorted mask of pain and desperation, his eyes wide and unblinking. "The box will take what it wants," he rasped, his voice fractured and trembling. "You can leave, but not without paying its price." Lucas's mind raced. What could he sacrifice? The thought of losing a loved one, a cherished memory, or even a part of himself was too much to bear. But as the ground beneath him trembled and the shadows deepened, he realized he had no choice. If he didn't act, the box would take everything. He closed his eyes, his hand hovering over the box. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice breaking. The photographs began to glow brighter, and a new image formed. It was his mother, smiling warmly, holding him as a baby. "No!" Lucas cried, recoiling. He couldn't give that up. The memory of his mother was one of the few things that gave him strength. But the box pulsed angrily, the glow intensifying as the figure of his uncle twisted and contorted in agony. "You must choose," the voice roared, now layered with countless others, a cacophony of tortured screams. Lucas's hands shook as tears streamed down his face. He reached into the box, pulling out the photograph of his mother, and held it tightly. In that moment, the shadows converged, the growl morphing into a deafening roar. The photograph burned in his hand, the edges curling into ash as the booth erupted into blinding light. Lucas screamed, the world around him dissolving into chaos. When the light faded, he was alone, the box gone, and the park eerily silent. His hand was empty, but his heart felt heavier than ever. He couldn't remember the photograph. Its details were a blank void in his mind. A piece of him was gone, and he couldn't even recall what it was. The park had fallen deathly silent. Not even the faint rustle of leaves or the creak of the old rides broke the oppressive quiet. Lucas stood motionless, his breath shallow, his flashlight flickering weakly in his hand. The memory of the photograph he had sacrificed, or whatever it had been, was already fading from his mind, leaving only a hollow ache in its place. The darkness around him seemed thicker now, alive with an unnatural energy. Every shadow felt heavier, stretching and shifting as if it had a will of its own. As Lucas took a cautious step forward, a faint sound reached his ears. It wasn't the growl or the distorted laughter he had heard before. This was something different, softer yet more menacing. A whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a breath against his ear. It spoke his name, drawing it out in a slow serpentine hiss. "Les." He froze, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The whisper came again, louder this time, and from multiple directions. "Why did you come here? You shouldn't have stayed. It's watching." The whispers overlapped, creating a dissonant symphony of voices. Some were soft and pleading, others mocking and cruel. Lucas spun in place, his flashlight casting frantic beams across the decrepit rides and booths. But no matter where he looked, the shadows seemed to close in, suffocating the light. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, not by one pair of eyes but by many, hundreds, maybe thousands. He felt them on him, pressing into his soul. The whispers grew louder, transforming into indistinct murmurs. Then suddenly, one voice emerged, clear and commanding. "Turn around." The words cut through the cacophony like a knife, sharp and absolute. Against his better judgment, Lucas turned, his flashlight beam falling on something he hadn't noticed before, a row of mirrors standing haphazardly in the middle of the park. They were old and cracked, their surfaces smeared with grime and streaked with what looked like dried blood. Despite their condition, they reflected light far too brightly, as though they were portals to something else entirely. Lucas approached cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The mirrors stood at odd angles, forming a crooked path that seemed to lead deeper into the park. As he got closer, he realized that the reflections weren't quite right. They showed him walking, but his movements were delayed, as if his reflection were watching him before deciding to mimic him. Worse, there were things in the mirrors, shapes that weren't there in the real world. In one mirror, a clown's face loomed over his shoulder, its hollow eyes staring straight at him. In another, a shadowy figure stood in the distance, growing closer with every step he took. A cold sweat broke out across Lucas's skin as he reached the first mirror. He hesitated, but the whispers urged him forward. "Look closer," they said, their tone both inviting and malevolent. He raised his flashlight and peered into the glass. His reflection stared back, but something was wrong, its eyes. They weren't his. They were dark, bottomless voids that seemed to pull him in, swallowing the light around them. As he stepped back in terror, the reflection smiled, its lips stretching impossibly wide. The mirror cracked violently, a jagged line splitting his reflection in two. From the fissure seeped a dark, viscous liquid that dripped to the ground, pooling at Lucas's feet. The smell was nauseating, metallic and putrid, like rotting flesh. He stumbled away, but the liquid spread unnaturally fast, snaking across the ground and reaching for his shoes. Panic surged through him, and he turned to flee, only to see that the mirrors now surrounded him, forming a perfect circle. Each mirror reflected something different, scenes from his life, distorted and twisted into nightmarish visions. In one, he saw himself as a child, cowering under a table while shadows writhed on the walls. In another, he stood over a grave, his hands stained red. And in the largest mirror, he saw his own face, but it was wrong, aged, hollow, and lifeless like a corpse. The whispers became laughter, cruel and mocking, echoing endlessly in the confined space. "Choose," the commanding voice boomed, silencing the laughter. Lucas's mind reeled. "Choose what?" The mirrors seemed to respond, each image shifting and beckoning to him. One showed his uncle, reaching out with desperation in his eyes. Another showed the box he had opened earlier, now glowing ominously. And another showed himself, walking away from the park, free but visibly broken. The laughter returned, louder and more chaotic, as the shadows inside the mirrors began to seep out, their forms twisting and merging into something monstrous. Lucas dropped his flashlight and fell to his knees, clutching his head as the cacophony threatened to drive him mad. "What do you want from me?" he screamed into the void. The shadows stopped, their form coalescing into a single towering figure. It leaned down, its face inches from his, though its features were hidden in darkness. "Everything," it whispered. The ground beneath him shifted, and he felt himself sinking. The mirrors shattered simultaneously, sending shards flying, but none touched him. Instead, they hovered around him, spinning faster and faster until they formed a vortex of glass and light. The figure watched silently as Lucas was pulled deeper into the maelstrom, its voice echoing one last time. "The truth is in the shadows, Lucas. But can you bear to see it?" Lucas opened his eyes, gasping for air, as if he had been pulled from drowning. He was no longer in the park. Instead, he stood in a dark, endless corridor, the walls lined with hundreds of dimly lit, warped mirrors. The air was heavy and oppressive, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood. Each mirror seemed alive, its surface rippling like water, reflecting not his current self but fragments of his worst fears. His breathing quickened as the corridor stretched endlessly before him, its end shrouded in shadow. Whispers surrounded him again, more insistent and menacing this time. They spoke in overlapping tones, their words laced with mockery and venom. "Do you remember this, Lucas? You were never strong enough. It's all your fault." Each voice seemed to pierce his mind, dredging up memories he had buried long ago. He tried to steady his thoughts, but the mirrors demanded his attention, each one displaying something worse than the last. The first mirror showed a hospital room, dimly lit and eerily still. Lucas's younger self stood by a hospital bed, his mother lying motionless beneath a thin, white sheet. Her chest didn't rise, her face was pale, and her eyes stared lifelessly at the ceiling. Lucas staggered back, shaking his head. "No, that's not how it happened," he whispered. But the whispers around him disagreed, laughing cruelly. "You left her alone," they hissed. "She called for you, and you didn't come." He turned away, But the next mirror was worse. It showed his reflection as an adult, standing in the middle of a forest, holding a flashlight. His face was contorted with fear, and his hands were stained red. As he watched, the image moved, and his reflection turned toward him, its eyes dark and accusing. "You can't run from this," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. The whispers around him grew louder, taunting him, feeding off his growing panic. Lucas stumbled forward, desperate to escape the mirrors, but the corridor stretched on endlessly, each step taking him deeper into the suffocating darkness. The next mirror stopped him cold. It reflected him, but this time he was surrounded by his family and friends. They were smiling, happy, alive. But as he watched, their faces began to change. Their eyes grew hollow, their smiles twisted into grotesque grins, and their hands reached for him through the glass. "Stay with us, Lucas," they whispered, their voices layered with a desperate hunger. He recoiled, the whispers now a deafening roar in his ears. Then, the mirrors began to shift. The reflections faded, replaced by swirling darkness. From within, shapes began to form, shadows with glowing empty eyes and mouths that opened in silent screams. They stepped out of the mirrors, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators stalking their prey. Lucas backed away, his heart pounding, his mind racing for an escape. The shadows encircled him, their voices now distinct, each one speaking directly to his deepest fears. "You're nothing without her. You let them die. You deserve this." Lucas clutched his head, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder. The shadows closed in, their forms shifting and contorting into familiar faces. His mother, his uncle, friends he had lost. They whispered his name, their eyes filled with sorrow and accusation. One of the shadows stepped forward, holding something in its hand, the photograph of his mother he had sacrificed. It held it out to him, its voice low and menacing. "Do you want it back, Lucas? Do you want to undo what you've done?" The temptation was overwhelming. Lucas reached out, his hand trembling, but the shadow pulled the photograph away, laughing coldly. "It's not that simple," it said. "To take this, you must give us more." The shadows began to chant, their voices merging into a single inescapable command. "Give us your fear." Lucas staggered back, his mind spinning. What did they mean? How could he give them his fear? The shadows seemed to sense his hesitation, growing larger and more oppressive. "Feed us your terror," they demanded. "Show us your deepest nightmares. Let us consume them, or let them consume you." The corridor began to warp, the mirrors shaking violently. Lucas fell to his knees, his head pounding as the shadows closed in. He saw flashes of his worst memories, his failures, his regrets, all swirling around him like a storm. The shadows fed on his anguish, growing darker and more powerful with each passing second. Lucas screamed, his voice echoing down the endless corridor. As his fear reached its peak, something shifted. The mirrors shattered simultaneously, their shards hanging suspended in the air like jagged stars. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and unstable. Lucas felt a surge of clarity, a flicker of resistance. If they wanted his fear, he wouldn't give it willingly. He closed his eyes, focusing on the faintest glimmer of hope buried deep within him. The whispers faltered, their confidence shaken. The shadows hissed, their forms dissolving into mist as the shards of broken mirrors rained down, cutting through the darkness like blades of light. The corridor began to collapse, the oppressive air lifting as the whispers faded into silence. Lucas opened his eyes, finding himself back in the park, the photograph gone, but the weight in his chest lighter. The park seemed to shift around Lucas as he stood in the stillness. The air was thick and damp, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Shadows danced and swirled at the edge of his vision, whispering his name in tones that felt both familiar and utterly alien. Each step he took seemed to echo endlessly, as if the park was stretching, pulling him deeper into its grasp. Lucas clutched the remnants of his courage, but the fear gnawed at him like a relentless predator. Somewhere in the darkness he could feel it, a presence, ancient and unspeakably malevolent, waiting for him to arrive. Ahead, the carousel stood eerily still, its once distorted tune now replaced by a low rhythmic thrum that resonated in his chest. The horses' faces seemed even more grotesque than before, their painted grins twisted into expressions of agony. Lucas's flashlight flickered again, but this time it wasn't the beam of light failing, it was the darkness itself pushing back, growing thicker, hungrier. The whispers grew louder, melding into a single guttural voice that echoed from all directions. "Come closer, Lucas. Drawn by an invisible force, Lucas approached the center of the park. There, beneath the carousel's shadow, stood a figure. It was tall and shrouded in darkness, its features obscured by a swirling void. The only thing visible was its eyes, two pinpoints of piercing, unearthly light that burned into Lucas's soul. It didn't move, but its presence radiated a suffocating aura, as if the air around it was vibrating with raw malice. Lucas froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The entity raised an arm, its movement slow and deliberate, pointing to something behind him. Lucas turned slowly, the weight of dread pressing down on him. There, illuminated by an unnatural glow, was the wooden box he had found earlier. But now it was different. The carvings pulsed with a dark energy, and the lid was slightly ajar, leaking tendrils of shadow that writhed and twisted like living things. A voice, soft and melodic yet laced with venom, spoke from the box. "You've taken something, Lucas. Now you must give." The figure moved closer, though its feet never touched the ground. It glided like a shadow untethered, and with each step, the world around them seemed to warp and distort. The carousel spun slowly, though no one was there to operate it, its haunting tune returning in a warped, discordant rhythm. The figure spoke again, its voice layered with countless others, both male and female, young and old. "Do you know what you've done? Do you understand the price?" Lucas's throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure laughed, a sound that was both chilling and sorrowful. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you owe." With a wave of its hand, the shadows surrounding the carousel exploded outward, engulfing the park in an impenetrable darkness. Within the void, images began to flicker, memories, fears, regrets, all blending together into a chaotic, nightmarish tapestry. Lucas saw himself as a child, sitting in his uncle's lap while the man whispered stories of the circus. He saw his mother, pale and motionless in a hospital bed. He saw himself alone, staring into a mirror that no longer reflected his face. The figure stepped closer, its presence now overwhelming. "This is the truth, Lucas. You've been running from it your entire life. But here in this place, there is no escape." The shadows began to coalesce around Lucas, forming tendrils that wrapped around his arms and legs, pulling him toward the box. The voice from within grew louder, more insistent. "Give us what we seek, or lose everything." Lucas struggled, his mind racing. What could he give? He had already sacrificed the photograph, a piece of himself. What more did they want? His thoughts were interrupted as the figure leaned in, its burning eyes inches from his own. "You," it whispered. "Your fear, your pain, your soul." The words hit Lucas like a physical blow. The tendrils tightened, dragging him closer to the box. He screamed, fighting against the pull, but the shadows were relentless. As he was dragged to his knees, he saw something glimmer in the corner of his eye, a fragment of the shattered mirror from earlier. In its jagged surface, he saw his reflection. But this time, it wasn't twisted or distorted. It was just him, scared but determined. Something clicked in his mind. The box, the shadows, the figure, they fed on fear. Without it, they were powerless. Summoning every ounce of courage, Lucas steadied his breathing and closed his eyes. He pictured his mother's smile, the warmth of his uncle's stories, the moments that gave him strength. The darkness around him faltered, the tendrils loosening slightly. The figure hissed, its voice filled with rage. "What are you doing? You cannot deny us." Lucas opened his eyes, meeting the figure's burning gaze. "You can't take what I won't give." The carousel screeched to a halt, its haunting tune silenced. The shadows recoiled, their forms unraveling into wisps of smoke. The box snapped shut, its carvings dimming. The figure let out a guttural roar, its form flickering like a dying flame. Lucas stood, his legs shaking but his resolve unbroken. The figure reached for him one last time, but its hand dissolved into ash before it could touch him. With a final echoing scream, it vanished, and the park was plunged into silence. Lucas stood alone in the stillness, his breath heavy, his heart pounding. The box was gone, and the park seemed to have returned to its desolate state. But as he turned to leave, he felt a faint chill on the back of his neck. A whisper barely audible lingered in the air, "This isn't over." The air hung heavy with an unnatural stillness as Lucas stood in the park's eerie emptiness. The shadows that once danced with life now seemed to watch, waiting for him to make the next move. Though he had broken the hold of the dark force for a moment, the weight of its presence lingered. Lucas felt it in his chest, a dull, suffocating ache that warned him this wasn't over. The whispers were gone, but the silence felt louder than ever, pressing into his ears like an unbearable hum. Ahead, the carousel began to spin slowly on its own, its haunting tune returning in a low, distorted hum. This time, however, the lights flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that stretched and writhed. The air crackled with electricity, and Lucas instinctively knew that this was it, the heart of the terror, the place where everything would end or begin again. With a deep breath, he stepped toward the carousel, his footsteps heavy against the cracked, uneven ground. As he approached, the carousel's horses twisted grotesquely, their painted faces contorting into expressions of anguish and rage. Their eyes seemed to follow him, their mouths opening wide in silent screams. Lucas clenched his fists, determined not to let his fear overtake him again. At the center of the carousel, the figure from before materialized once more, emerging from the swirling shadows like a phantom. It towered over him, its form even more menacing than before, and its burning eyes locked onto his. "You cannot escape, Lucas," the figure said, its voice layered with countless others, each one dripping with malice. "You broke the rules. Now, you will face the consequences." Lucas stood his ground, his voice trembling but resolute. "What do you want from me? I've already sacrificed enough." The figure laughed, a sound that made his skin crawl. "Enough? You think this is about a simple offering? This is about truth, Lucas. The truth you've been running from your entire life. You brought this upon yourself." With a wave of its hand, the shadows erupted, forming a swirling vortex around the carousel. Within the vortex, Lucas saw flashes of his past, his mother's death, his uncle's disappearance, and all the moments of fear and regret he had buried deep within himself. The images twisted and warped, merging with nightmarish visions of clowns with hollow eyes and twisted grins, of himself trapped in a mirror, his reflection screaming silently for help. The figure stepped closer, its voice low and venomous. "To end this, you must confront what you fear most. But be warned, few survive the truth." Before Lucas could respond, the shadows surged forward, engulfing him in darkness. The world around him vanished, replaced by a desolate void. He stood alone, surrounded by nothingness, until a single spotlight illuminated a scene in front of him. It was the hospital room from his childhood. He saw himself as a boy, sitting in a chair next to his mother's bed. She looked frail and lifeless, her hand clutching a small clown figurine that his uncle had given her. The boy stared at her, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I didn't mean to leave." Lucas's chest tightened as he watched the memory unfold. He remembered this moment, how he had been too afraid to stay in the room, how he had run away when she called out for him. The guilt he had carried ever since felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. The shadows around the scene began to close in, the whispers returning, mocking him. "You abandoned her. You failed her." "No," Lucas shouted, his voice echoing in the void. "I was a kid. I didn't know what to do." The scene shifted, dissolving into another memory. This time, he saw himself as a teenager, standing at the edge of a forest. His uncle's voice echoed from somewhere deep within, calling for help. But Lucas didn't move. He was frozen in fear, unable to face whatever was out there. The memory twisted, the forest transforming into the park, and his uncle appeared, his face contorted with pain. "You let me disappear, Lucas," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "You let it take me." Lucas fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know," he cried. "I didn't understand what was happening." The shadows swirled around him, forming into the figure once more. It towered over him, its burning eyes blazing with fury. "You've always run from your fear, Lucas. But now, there is no escape. Face it, or be consumed by it." Summoning every ounce of strength, Lucas stood, his legs trembling but his resolve unwavering. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "I've been running my whole life. But not anymore." The shadows surged forward, and Lucas braced himself. He closed his eyes, focusing on the memories of love and warmth that had carried him through the darkest times. His mother's smile, his uncle's laughter, the strength he had found in himself. The darkness faltered, the whispers fading into silence. The figure roared, its form flickering and unstable. Lucas opened his eyes, meeting the figure's gaze. "You don't control me," he said. "Not anymore." With those words, the shadows dissolved, and the figure let out a final ear-piercing scream before vanishing into the void. The carousel ground to a halt, its lights dimming one by one. The park was silent again, but this time, the silence felt peaceful. Lucas stood alone, the weight of his past lifted from his shoulders. He knew the darkness might return someday, but he also knew he was stronger now. As he turned to leave, a faint whisper lingered in the air. "This isn't the end, Lucas." Lucas stepped out of the park into the cold embrace of the night. His heart was still pounding, and his breath came in shallow gasps. The once vibrant lights of the carnival were now completely extinguished, leaving behind only the skeletal silhouettes of rides and tents against the pale moonlight. It was over, or so he thought. As he walked away, the eerie silence felt unnatural, as though the park itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to look back. He paused at the edge of the park, his instinct screaming that something wasn't right. The photograph, the wooden box, the whispers, they had all vanished as if they had never existed. But Lucas knew better. The weight of what he had experienced lingered in the air, an invisible shroud draped over him. Every shadow seemed alive, watching him leave. He glanced at his hand, half expecting to find the scars of the choices he had made. Instead, his palm was clean, yet it felt heavier than ever, as if the darkness had left a mark that no one could see. He turned one last time to face the park, and that's when he saw it. A faint light flickered from the center of the carousel, a pulse barely visible in the distance. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't welcoming either. It felt like a warning, a reminder that the nightmare wasn't entirely gone. Lucas clenched his fists, fighting the urge to go back. Something deep within him whispered that the park wasn't finished with him. Not yet. The whispers began again, faint and far away, like the echo of a memory. They called his name, twisting it in ways that made his skin crawl. "Lucas, come back. Lucas." He shook his head, trying to block them out, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they sounded as if they were right behind him. He spun around, his pulse racing, but there was nothing there. Only the park, now cloaked in an even darker, more oppressive silence. Lucas quickened his pace, his mind racing with unanswered questions. What was the figure? Why had it chosen him? And most importantly, what had he truly given up in that park? The memory of the photograph he had sacrificed was gone, but he could feel its absence like a phantom pain. He tried to recall his mother's face, the warmth of her smile, but it was blurred now, like an image seen through frosted glass. Panic bubbled up in his chest. Had the park taken more than just the photograph? Was it slowly erasing parts of him, piece by piece? As he reached his car, parked just beyond the crumbling fence, Lucas felt the weight of something in his pocket. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Slowly, he reached inside and pulled out a small object. It was a clown figurine, identical to the one he had seen in his childhood memories. Its painted smile seemed wider now, almost mocking. He turned it over in his hand, and there, etched into the base, were the words, "This isn't goodbye." Lucas dropped the figurine as if it had burned him. It hit the ground with a hollow thud, rolling to rest with its painted eyes staring up at him. The whispers returned, louder this time, not distant but inside his head. They spoke of promises and bargains, of unfinished business. He clutched his head, trying to drown them out, but they only grew stronger, a cacophony of laughter, screams, and voices that didn't belong to this world. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the whispers stopped. The figurine was gone, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. The silence was deafening, but Lucas knew better than to trust it. He got into his car, his hands shaking as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but the radio crackled to static. He reached to turn it off, but before he could, a single voice emerged from the noise. "See you soon, Lucas." The words sent a shiver down his spine. He slammed the radio off and pulled out onto the deserted road, his tires kicking up gravel as he sped away. But no matter how far he drove, the feeling of being watched never left him. The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness outside his car pressing against the windows like a living thing. He checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the middle of the road, but there was nothing. Only the night. And yet, as he drove, the faintest trace of the carousel's haunting tune played in his mind, unshakable and eternal. It wasn't just a memory, it was a promise. The park wasn't finished with him. It had let him go for now, but it had left its mark. Lucas knew deep down that he would never truly escape. Whatever darkness had claimed the park was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. As the first hints of dawn broke over the horizon, Lucas finally pulled over, his body trembling with exhaustion. He stepped out of the car, breathing in the cold morning air. The world seemed normal again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was an illusion. He stared at the rising sun, hoping its light would chase away the shadows that lingered in his mind. But as he turned to get back in the car, something caught his eye. On the passenger seat, where there had been nothing before, sat the clown figurine, its painted smile wider than ever. What truly happened to Lucas in the park? And what will happen when the darkness inevitably returns? Share your theories in the comments and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay tuned to Haunted Grounds for more stories that will haunt your dreams.